Sawabona family, it's been a long time and we've missed you. And we hope you all have missed us as much as we've missed you. But we are back. The Critically Conscious Classroom is back. And in the classroom today, we are leading and teaching like our democracy depends on it.
Hmm.
And it has been a while. I've definitely missed being on the show. Anthony, I know we're right next door to each other, but this is a whole different space. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited that we actually have Dr. Travis Bristol with us today as our first guest. So history in the making after a little hiatus. Dr. Bristol is going to be our guest today, and let me tell you a little bit about him. Well, I actually met Dr. Bristol at a convening at the California Department of Education. It was a convening around the recruitment for more teachers of color.
Mm.
So that really got me interested in Dr. Bristol's work. But let me tell you what his bio says because it's super impressive. He's an associate professor at UC Berkeley School of Education, the Department of African American Studies, as well as faculty director of the Center for Research on Expanding Educational Opportunity. His research focuses on the role of educational policies in shaping teacher workplace experiences and retention, professional learning communities, and the intersections of race and gender in educational settings.
Mm.
He's authored a number of publications, is on a number of editorial boards, um, received numerous honors, American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award. That conference is coming up in LA, right, next month. Secured over $7.4 million in research funding. We need to talk to those people too, Anthony, I think. And then chairing the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, the first Black person to do so. So lots of first actually here in this room. So yeah, I'm excited to have everyone listen or watch this soon.
Well, Dr. Bristol, it's not like you're not already in the room with us, so we want to welcome you as though you weren't sitting here listening to us. Dr. Bristol, welcome to the Critically Conscious Classroom. How you doing?
Good to be here, Anthony and Tracy. I'm well. I'm well. And this is I'm looking forward to the conversation. Looking forward to the
Hey,
conversation.
definitely, and we'll definitely jump into that. But one of the things that I don't think I heard Tracy say, I know, Dr. Bristol, you started out teaching in New York.
Yeah.
Are
Yes.
you from New York?
I'm from Brooklyn,
You're
in
from
particular.
Brooklyn. So
I'm
let me
from-
ask you a quick question before I jump into the first question. Jay-Z
Oh,
or
you're
Nas?
not going to do East Coast versus West Coast
No,
rap, are you?
I
Okay.
was gonna keep it all East Coast. I wasn't gonna say
Okay.
Biggie or Pac. I wasn't gonna
Okay.
do that to him because he already knows the right answer. But I wanted to ask him, Jay-Z or Nas?
Jay-Z, Concrete Jungles, Where Dreams Are Made Of. That's how I got to be here. Yeah.
Word,
Concrete Jungles,
word,
Where Dreams Are Made Of.
word.
Yeah.
I feel you on that, Dr. Bristol. So, first question for you, sir. Your research centers on how educational policies shape teachers' workplace experiences and retention. What first drew you to this work, and why
Mhm.
does it matter so deeply right now?
Yeah. So what first drew me to this work was a wondering about whether policymakers were asking the right questions. 2000 in the 2009, right? Then Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan goes to Morehouse to recruit Black men, calling Black men to the Blackboard. I was a doctoral student then, and as a former, you mentioned Anthony, right? As a former teacher in New York City, um, I knew that efforts to get me into the profession were easy in some ways. Keeping me was harder. And so the question that policymakers seem to focus on and to raise money around and to obsess about was getting people in. The harder question was about how you get people like all of us, right, folks of color, to stay in the profession. And so as a researcher, I was drawn to this work because I wasn't sure that policymakers were asking the right questions. Because if you ask the wrong questions, then what you prescribe might only keep the pipeline leaking rather than patch it. And so as a researcher, I wanted to understand, are these the right questions? And if these aren't the right questions, what are the right questions?
Yeah, the idea of research, right? And really this idea of like you're always going to find data that answers your question, right? And that's and that's a lot of the work that's being done in schools. I know talking about professional learning communities, right, was one of the things I read in your bio. And in PLCs, we center conversations around data, specifically student data.
Mhm.
So your research, right, studied that. And what did you find? What's been the trend in terms of what you've been finding? Um, and how has that changed some of the questions that maybe you've been, you know, for the policymakers that you've been working
Yeah.
with?
Yeah. So to this question, Tracy, and then sort of building off of Anthony's question, one finding was that policymakers and practitioners weren't paying enough attention to retention.
Mhm.
And in fact, teachers of color, and in my initial work, Black men teachers, right, were leaving at a higher rate than their peers. And so the need to think about why Black men, or why teachers of color or Black teachers, why they were leaving at a higher rate, I think became an important question. And what I found, right, was that it was actually the principal. So that's why I'm so excited to be talking to administrators, because um, you know, I had in this study, I had Black men who were in schools by themselves and Black men who were in schools with multiple Black men teachers. That was the way those were the two sort of my comparison groups. And on average, schools that had multiple Black men were led by people of color. And those teachers were leaving those schools led by people of color because of the working conditions that those principals were creating. In some ways, tasking the educators to do more than everyone else. And so one finding was, right, that teachers, they don't leave their students. They actually come to the profession because of their students, but they leave teaching because of their principals. And so the work is, how do you help principals? How do you develop principals, build their capacity to create the conditions to support teachers?
Yes, I am a firm believer that principals make all the difference.
Yeah.
As a former assistant superintendent,
Mm,
it was definitely a goal to make sure that my principals, especially if they were new,
yes.
were supported, right? And as a former principal myself, I always lamented the district office meetings because then you'd walk away with more work, right? When we didn't want that. We wanted to make sure that everything tied together and it didn't feel like that. But when times will get tough, that you always felt like you had a thought partner to help in the work. Um, so that I think is, yeah, definitely what our folks need to hear about, right? We definitely need the majority of our members in ACSA are principals or site leaders.
Yes.
And I know that we always don't necessarily have enough support for them, right? And actually, we're in the midst of creating more supports
Mm,
to make sure that they endure.
yeah.
So this next question is about your studies still, right? You study the intersections of race and gender in education, right? Particularly educators of color, as you mentioned. Um, and you talked about this a little bit. What are some of the patterns you've seen in how schools experience and treat teachers of color? You
Yeah.
said people leave because of the conditions that principals create, right? So what works and what doesn't? What causes folks to stay in and stay in education?
Stay and lead and what shapes their experiences. And I'll also get back to the question about professional learning because I think that plays a piece here as well. So one of the findings in some of my earlier work and continues to be true in some of the current work is how teachers, particularly teachers of color, and in some of the initial work, Black men teachers, how they were positioned in their schools. Secretary King used the word invisible tax, right? That these educators were that the beliefs that people had about Black men outside of the school, that their colleagues brought those same beliefs inside of the school. So outside of the school, if I'm walking down the street, people will cross on the other side. Why? Because they fear me. So in the school, if I am also feared, then you give me the most challenging students, because the most challenging students will fear me. But what does that mean for me as a teacher? It means that you don't see me as a teacher, you see me as a police officer. Um, I'm not viewed as someone who has curricular expertise, but someone who reifies or allows for the continuation of maintaining the carceral state. And so in some of my initial work, right, many of these men of color talked about how they were perceived as a disciplinarian, and so they rarely had space and time to work on and improve their practice. When I became a teacher in New York City, I was trained at Stanford, and on day one, I felt like I could teach. I felt ready to teach. But when, Indigenous Peoples Day came, back then in the early 2000s, we called it Columbus Day. I had all these boys of color transferred into my class. I didn't know what to do, because the high quality preparation at Stanford didn't prepare me for that. And so because people were positioned as police officers, they didn't have space and time to work on their practice. An outgrowth of that, of my research, because I was also interested in practice, was creating a professional learning community for men of color. In Boston, we called it the Boston Male Educators of Color Network, right? The professional learning community focused on helping men of color improve their practice, right? It helped men of color think about, well, what do you do when people send you all these quote unquote misbehaving boys, right? So because of how they were positioned in schools, an outgrowth of that became the professional learning community. Now, I'll just quickly say this about professional learning communities. Professional learning communities, and this is, I think, true of some of my research in New York City, studying NYC Men Teach, which is the nation's largest men teach of color initiative. Professional learning communities keep educators of color, I would say, in the profession, not in their schools. So, because it's the principal that drives people out, but because I'm in this professional learning community, I know that maybe there's a school across town where the conditions are different. So I'm going to move to that school, not leave the profession.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I've I've been sitting here just listening to this, and it's like you interviewed me, because everything that you're saying, it more than resonates with me. It's my life. So
Wow.
I'll go back, though I had already graduated from Morehouse.
Oh,
By 2009, I graduated in 2006.
wow.
But I remember, and it wasn't through Arnie Duncan, but I do remember that there was an influx of schools and other programs trying to recruit all of us, regardless of your major. Hey, get in
Right.
the classroom, be a teacher, all these types
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And what's most interesting, when I went into undergrad, that's what my family told me I should do. They said, you would be a great educator.
Wow.
But after talking to those folks, it seemed like I was more of a means to an end, right? That it was about optics. It
Yeah.
looks good to have,
Yeah.
especially a Morehouse man in the classroom, so I
Yes.
opted
Yes.
out.
Yes.
Uh, but clearly, that was my life's calling, and after a few years of doing something else, I did become an educator.
Mm.
And, um, I started my career as a middle school special education teacher, co-teaching an English class.
Wow.
And to your point, right? I was doing everything but teaching. Though I have an English degree, I was an honors graduate from Morehouse. I was the person they needed anytime there was a discipline issue. Uh,
Wow.
Anytime a student didn't have a father, and
Yes.
and they wanted a black male to talk to them.
Right.
Anytime there was some type of crisis,
Yes.
and they
Yeah.
wanted me to work in conjunction
Wow.
with our dean of discipline. So I
Wow.
spent more time in the office than I
Wow.
actually did delivering instruction.
Wow.
I'll add this layer to it as well. my caseload were only the black male students who had
Bro.
been diagnosed as emotionally disturbed, right? So
Yes.
I had the students who were on that in that pipeline to prison, right? And some of them had already been in juvenile hall, some of them were coming out. Um, and I know a part of your research, you know, as I'm thinking about my experience, a huge part of your research, you talk about the invisible tax,
Mm,
right? And I'm just feeling it in my soul as you're talking
mm,
about it, especially as you talk about folks who leave the school site but don't leave the profession, right? So
mm.
in addition to this work, I'm also an adjunct professor because I love education. But to
Yes.
your point, I've completely left K-12 as an educator, and though I'm still teaching, it's not the same, right? Because I got into this for the babies, right? So, um, but speaking to that invisible tax that particularly male educators of color experience, Dr. Bristol, can you explain exactly what that means, what it looks like, and how it impacts and affects educators and more importantly, the students?
Yeah. So Anthony, I mean, it's almost as if, to your point, what you've just described is what I, it's some of the work that I did talking to black men teachers in Boston. It is the um, I am sitting eating my lunch at 12 o'clock because I have to eat my lunch, and my well-meaning colleague brings in X and Y student, mostly boys. I'm in during, so I can't even eat my lunch. I'm being taxed. It's an extra task that I have to do. It's my planning period. How do I become a better teacher? What am I assessed on? Delivering high quality instruction. The planning period is designed to work on my instruction. And as I am fourth period, when I'm eating my lunch, someone's in my classroom. I can't eat my lunch. Sixth period, when I'm planning for seventh period or for the tomorrow, again, someone brings in another student for me to watch and manage. And so it is that. So that is right. This tax. This is John King's Secretary King, excuse me, his language. But the positioning of these educators in ways that that they are expected to do more without the training, Anthony. I mean, this is the point that you made, right? And this was sort of my own experience. I had when I started on day one, I could design group worthy tasks. I could redesign, based on how students did on an assessment. I could redesign the assessment, recognizing that it was not the students, it was me. But there was nothing in this preparation at Stanford, right, that helped me understand what to do, right? At 21, as someone who did not grow up with a father in the house, to then be a father to all these quote unquote boys that everyone transferred into my classroom. And to your point, Anthony, about what it does for the students, my colleague Ed Brockenbrow, Professor Ed Brockenbrow at UPenn, talks about students, particularly black boys, saying, he uses a quote from one of his studies, "You ain't my daddy." That the students are saying, the school is telling you to be my father, but you aren't my father, right? And so that creates even more tension because students are being positioned and believed to be fatherless, right? And so, so that's what it does to the students. That's what it does to the teachers. And I think that what we need in the profession is we need to help all teachers understand how to support all students, so that I'm so that I know how to work with all students and not having to send students out to someone else's class.
You both are just making me reflect on my time as a principal, right? And the construct of my school and the conditions absolutely that I created. Um my first school, I was actually on a guest on a podcast earlier today, and I was saying how my first job, my first principal job, 2 months later, I was told that I had to close the school.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow.
I know. And
Wow.
it was in the days of program improvement, right?
Mm.
No Child Left Behind. And
Or No Child Left.
yeah. And so we were in year one program improvement because, predictable data. Um, our African American students did not make the goal for 2 years in a row, I believe. So so it was this multiple layered, right, multifaceted situation of like, what do we do? What do we do with this? We have babies. I'm a new principal, and
Mm.
the staff was obviously very, very angry that their school was going to be closed, but we wanted to do right by our students. It was the first year that we were implementing professional learning communities, and I'd like to say that our site actually did it really well, whereas other sites were having problems. And we brought in a number of folks to help our teachers, and this came from my instructional leadership team, right? If we, they understood this idea of targeted universalism before we were talking about targeted universalism, and Dr. Powell's work, right?
Mm.
We said, well, let's really focus on our African American students, because obviously we as a staff did not do right by them. So my assistant principal at the time, whose mom was a former administrator of the county office, we found all the community resources. We brought in professional development. We brought in, parents, obviously, right, to work in partnership, and other community members. And we closed the school and we raised test scores at the same time. And all the babies went to their other schools positioned really well. That was the one school. Then I had the task of combining two schools, right? Because I went to another school, brought some staff with me. And the first thing I found was a number of Black boys standing outside the door.
Mm.
So then it, brought up this whole other conversation about how to support students, what we need to do, right? What we know, what we don't know, and understand. And you make me think about who my African American staff were on campus.
Mm.
I believe I had 2 teachers at the time and probably a few teaching assistants. Um, and that was where we decided we were going to bring in, our high schoolers from the local high school. Um, Miss Allen, she was teaching Black Studies in the Ethnic Studies department. She was the advisor for the Black Student Union. We decided to create this mentor program. Um, but those are just like some examples, right? So again, you're making me reflect, and I'm not saying that as, a pat on my back, but I also think like there are very intentional things that you can do once you realize that there's more help that can be, right, that can be brought in, right, especially from the community, especially when you are partnering with folks, and you're just showing the baby some love.
Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah. I think that the focus on what I'm hearing you say is that often in schools, when there's a challenge, we use a magnifying glass and we say it's the children in front of us rather than a mirror to say it's the adults in the school. And what kinds of professional learning might the adults need in the school mirror so that they can create the conditions where children can learn, right? And so I think that is not often what happens in schools, right? Often what happens in schools is we punish the children. Um, we expect them to play catch up or to meet the same goals when they've started behind, right? So those Black children who were not doing well on tests, it wasn't because they were starting at the same place, right? They were starting behind because of the country's national, state, and local continued disinvestment in Black communities and Black schools. And so they were playing catch ups. So we're going to blame the kids and close their school, right? Not build the capacity of the adults to support
Right,
them.
right. So in places, right, in your work, and in folks, in partnership with the folks that you worked with across the country, Are you finding places where there are bright spots? And
Yeah.
what are some of the conditions there that are created that our viewers, our listeners can learn from?
So I was just clearly this I know that your audience is national, but you also have a strong presence here in the state of California. I actually just jumped from, and you put this in my bio, about chairing the national board for professional teaching standards. I just had a board meeting about right before we got on here. In the state of California, and so I'm going to say here every time I can have an opportunity to say this, that there is an incentive program that if teachers who are teaching in high priority schools, if they certify if they become a national board certified teacher, they get a $5,000 incentive annually. Annually. And so what we're seeing in places like Oakland, for example, right? Oakland has, like many urban spaces or urban school districts, Oakland has a great deal of challenges. And what we're seeing is that there are teachers who are committed to staying in this district, staying in this city, who are pursuing national board certification. And what that certification process does is it raises their capacity to become better teachers, where they're learning what they're doing that's working and what they're doing that isn't working. They're reflecting on their practice through video, through student work. And so, because this is a state program, I think there are policy levers like national board certification that certain districts are taking up that I think raises the capacity of teachers to become better teachers, full stop. So I think that's one effort. I talked also about the work happening in New York City, NYC Men Teach. And this program, it started actually 10 years ago. I was actually part of some of the initial support with the district and the mayor's office around some of the design. What's so important about the work that's happening in New York City and NYC Men Teach is that it's more than just recruitment. That each of the folks, they call them anchors, the men of color who come into the district, they get assigned a mentor. In this country, right, teachers, if you go to a 6-week program or a 1-year program, your learning and your readiness doesn't end when you enter the classroom. You need ongoing support. And so in New York City, what they've done and why they've continued to recruit and retain men of color is because they're also thinking about building the capacity of the teacher once they start and staying with that teacher over time. And then I'll end with this piece here. Because of some of my initial work around teachers leaving their principals, one of the things that I've done is I've started to actually teach in principal leadership programs. So here at Berkeley, I teach our aspiring school principals in the Principal Leadership Institute because absolutely principals need to be instructional leaders. They need to understand how to support teachers to improve backwards design, to improve their practice, to engage in backwards design, for example. And when aspiring principals also need to understand the social dynamics in their building. So if I'm walking down the hall and it's lunchtime and I see Anthony sitting in his classroom when all of the other teachers are sitting in the teacher's lounge, I need to understand and know that there's something about the culture in the school that I've created, that I've allowed, that makes this one black man teacher feel like that he can't participate, right, in the school organizational context. And so I think that efforts around building the capacity of aspiring school leaders, like the work we're doing at UC Berkeley, similar to what's happening at UCLA, also I think becomes another promising practice, right, to answer your question, Tracie.
Yeah, I wish that that teacher preparation programs and administrative preparation programs, that there was coherence across the state at the very least.
Yes.
I
Don't
was
get me
actually
started. Please don't get me started. Please.
well,
Okay.
but it was
Yeah.
so that was a question that was asked of me. I presented at California Faculty Association on ethnic studies, and that was a question that came from one of the professors. What could we do? And I said, first, all y'all in the room, can you all just align your programs so
Okay.
that so that districts don't have to reteach, right? Or teach some more. Our first year teachers, second year teachers already have this this process with induction. Um, but to your point in terms of like principal professional development, principal leadership, I adjunct as well. Um, and I taught the organizational leadership class. It's the first class for administrator credential program for Cal Lutheran last summer.
Oh,
And I had my students start with themselves, right?
mm,
Their story of self,
yes.
why they came into the profession,
Yes.
right? How does their identity, their lived experience play into who they are as leaders?
Yes.
And it was really tough mirror work.
Mm,
But I know, because I saw their portfolio work just a few weeks ago, I know that first conversation made an impact and affected their thinking the rest of the way, right, through their coursework.
yeah.
But you brought up a huge point, and I love that, and I will think about that and incorporate that into my class, right? How do they understand the culture of their school sites right now,
Yes.
right? I actually had them do some power mapping. And it would be really interesting for folks that are listening to actually think about, their particular school site and who eats where, who hangs out with whom.
Stop during staff meetings. Who doesn't?
Yes, yes. What are they
Yeah.
doing? Who's asking the questions? Who's on your instructional leadership team? Right? All of these things that signal
Yep.
lots of different messages to who is part of the fabric and who may not be. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What other best practices can you share? What are some things that you've seen that really support principals with understanding and especially avoiding um, invisibly taxing their educators of color?
So, um, so I appreciate this, I think this PAR mapping that you've talked about. I've also in the principal leadership course that I teach, I also have um students actually read research about the experiences of teachers of color, right? Because often in teacher preparation programs or leadership programs or preparation programs, the the unit of analysis is often the white teacher, and it's how to help the white teacher become better, right? With working with students of color, right? The joke that I often give, when I was at Stanford, I remember one class we had to talk about our white privilege. Well, you know what? Lo and behold, I didn't have any. But most of my colleagues in my class were white, and so we had to learn and talk about this. So, I think having aspiring leaders actually read about articles, right, about the school-based experiences of teachers of color, right, might help them also think about. I know that Dr. Yolanda Silveris is one of the keynotes, my mentor, right, and friend, right, to this point, right, that once you have people think about other people, it also invites them to do what she calls this archaeology of self, helps them think about themselves. And so, one, to answer your question, right, thinking about and reading the accounts of teachers of color helps them think about how you then support them, right?
Okay, can I add on a little twist? I think our conversation is perhaps assuming that the principal in this case is white.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
So let's be specific. What if they are not? What if they're a person of color themselves?
Yeah, I was not actually. I was not. I guess I'm also thinking about the last cohort of folks that I taught in PLI. So, as some of your, there was a state grant, the Delphi grant, right, where It gave money to leadership programs and school districts to recruit more folks of color to become. So about 90% of the students in my class were actually students of color, Black, Latinx, Asian American. There is this assumption that just because you and I and all of us in this room show up in the way that we do, that we have been insulated from, for example, the anti-Blackness, the anti-immigrant, the belief in, right, the quote unquote model minority, that we've all been insulated. And I think that that's not the case. And in some ways we perpetuate those things even more because sadly, the way that we got our positions was because we drank the proverbial Kool-Aid. So I'm not assuming at all that in my head, the reference group, it wasn't actually white principals. It was all the folks who live in the system, right? That continue to produce the same outcomes where people who look like Travis still can't read by the third grade.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you make a really good point. And so it's, again, it's self-reflection for all of us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all drank the Kool-Aid. We all perpetuate the system that we are, as DEI folks, right? As equity warriors, equity champions, whatever, however we want to label. We are working within a system that we're also trying to change, but then we perpetuate some of the same patterns over and over and over again. So
Yes.
it means that it takes some extra hard looks in the mirror to, and intentionally interrogating some of the actions and the decisions that we particularly make.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I do think that that's really important that, what we both said in terms of it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter because you're right. Like we show up in some spaces and there's a lot of assumptions. People don't know our stories to how we got there. But now that we are in this place, in this space, let's kind of talk about responsibility. Because when I still hold it. I mean, I'm not currently in a school district, but I still feel and hold a lot of responsibility for the fact that I am one of the very few Filipino Americans in a statewide position, right?
Wow.
When I was in school district, I was probably one of 5
Wow.
Filipino Americans in a cabinet position. There are only 2 Filipino American superintendents right now in the state of California.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Wow.
So there's a lot of responsibility,
Yes.
right? And when we think about principals and their professional learning and preparing them to support, right, so they can create better conditions, how does this idea of responsibility, especially being a person of color, come through?
So I think it's important to sort of lead, to be vulnerable and lead with and allowing oneself to be vulnerable. 2 days ago, I gave a keynote to about 1,200 power educators. At some point, we don't have time for this conversation, but I do think that there's some work around what principals think and how they position power educators. But that's a conversation for another day. But what I said to the power educators, and again, the word power educator is problematic because they're not abnormal educators, right? They're educators. Was I said when I began teaching the first year in New York City, if you talked about the Black boys, if you were to walk by my classroom, the folks who were standing outside of my classroom were the young Black women. Why? Because as a first generation American, someone who's raised in a patriarchal culture, there was some cognitive dissonance when a young Black woman challenged me. And so how did I, as a man, respond? I responded by kicking them out. And so what I shared with, and I continue to share, was that this is also me, right? I, to this point, reified, perpetuated, right? Notions of misogynoir, right? particularly discrimination against Black women. So, and I had to do some unlearning. So I'm not absolving myself of this. And I share, I'm very vulnerable. And it's hard, right? To say that I was responsible for kicking out, excluding young Black women. And I share that story to say that that this is all of us, because we're all breathing the same kind of air. And I had to do some learning with a mentor to help me understand, Travis, you're using a magnifying glass, but there's actually a mirror. There's something about you and about what you came to the school with that allows for these outcomes.
I just had to wait to see if Tracie had 7 other questions. No, but the excellent things. But I wanna bring it back to the teachers. So, I've just really been all of the things you said were great, but I was just really been thinking about what you said, particularly about the students or the teachers rather in Oakland and New York City, and you were talking about building capacity and mentorship. You talked a bit about professional development as well. Um, but my mind has still been stuck in trying to eat my lunch, right?
Mm.
Um, because it took me back to a place, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things we talk about often on our show is self-care,
Mm.
taking care of oneself, right?
Mm.
And I can think of back to myself at least, that was one of the things that I was missing, particularly as a Black male teacher.
Yes.
Um, and that is one of the main things that helped to usher me out of the K-12 site, but also made me question for a number of years if I wanted to stay in education, right? And we know that you do work across the nation. And you work with folks who are staying in the profession, staying in the classrooms. Um, so we want to know, what have you learned from the teachers themselves about what actually keeps them in this profession? What keeps them hungry? What keeps them firm in their belief system and in their why for serving students?
Mm. So it varies. That's maybe the research answer. There's no sort of specific. I So one, I think it's working conditions that teachers feel like the work is manageable, like they can do it. And when they feel like they can't do it, then they don't stay. So I think that's a piece. Um, I also think that, but there's also this sort of like there's a demographic piece in terms of like the demographic shifts. And I think for younger teachers, millennial teachers, I guess now they're probably I don't know, I guess it's Gen Z, that also finding ways to be in community um, is also important um, as a way to stay in the profession. And I think to this last piece around self-care, I mean, it's not something that, professional learning that I participated in the early 2000s, people didn't mention this idea of self-care, but in work that like the teaching well is doing right here and across the state of California, helping teachers to get to this sense of wellness. That what we're seeing is professional learning that really attends to not only the practice piece, but the social and emotional components of educators' development. And so understanding when to stop, understanding breathing techniques, understanding the importance of saying no, right? I think continue to help teachers stay in the profession.
Yes, shout out to the teaching well. I was a former board member.
Oh wow! Oh
So,
wow!
hi,
Yeah, yeah.
Lindsay. They are doing some really great work, and I'm glad that you brought in, that there are organizations that are out there. We work a lot with Toby Scruggs Hussein, who's also out of Oakland, um, and it is a conversation that I think maybe just was able to be a spotlight on because of the pandemic, right? And at the time, it was prior to that, it was on students, and then magnified the staff even more. But I would say that for administrators, the conversation is still fairly new. I would say
Yeah.
that it's probably just within the last few years because, again, there's this assumption about the role and also, going back to this idea of responsibility, right? If I'm trying to create the conditions for staff, that includes giving them time, making sure they have time to take care of themselves, to rest. It's not necessarily applied to themselves, right? They
Yeah.
take on the rest of the work. So I think that's still a conversation in progress. And, then of course, I think the implications there are for district office and superintendents to think about, okay, well, what are the things that you are asking your principals to do, right? If they are really the folks that are going to help move systems, create coherence in your system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a conversation not only for principals, but also for superintendents, all the folks who sit up in the C-suite who, because of how they have organized their work, don't have space and time to spend in schools with teachers and students.
Mm. So shout out to the superintendents that actually get out
Yes.
on the daily. I know a few that make it a huge point to start their days
Oh, wow.
at school sites.
Wow.
And I'm really mad that I can't remember the superintendent's name at the moment, but there is someone I heard recently who teaches at a specific school on Mondays.
Wow.
It's
Is it Misty? Yes,
Her from
Misty Her, Fresno.
Yes,
Shout out
to Misty.
the first
Wow.
and only Hmong woman
Wow. Yes.
superintendent in the state of California.
Oh.
Yes, thank you, Anthony. She just shared that.
Yes. Yes.
So,
That's
when
not
we think
surprising.
about patterns, right? Patterns and your superintendent makes it a priority, then hopefully the work follows suit that everywhere else in the system there's an opportunity to do that as well. Ooh, so much. I'm intrigued by a lot of the things that you've said, and I'm looking forward to your keynote at the ACSA Equity Institute. But before we ask you that question, what's next for you in terms of research? What are you looking at?
So this current research project that it'll be a book project, I'm interested in diasporic connections. So much of the work in early part of my career focused on Black teachers in urban centers. A new research project that I have completed, now I'm in the data analysis stage, has been interviewing and then visiting teachers of African descent in 4 Latin American countries: Panama, Colombia, Uruguay, and Brazil. Because there's this belief in the US that we are exceptional. And I think there's a belief that the kinds of anti-Blackness that happens in the US, it's exceptional only to the US. And when I visited teachers in Sao Paulo, in Salvador de Bahia, in Montevideo, in Bogota, Black teachers, right, who show up in the world, who look like me, they look like Anthony, right? And they talk about how their experiences in schools are quite similar to the Black teachers that I interviewed in Boston, in Oakland. And so some of my new work is trying to create, these sort of to understand that while there are differences, there are also these diasporic connections. And the experiences that people had when they came across this great ocean on a ship that took them from the same points, but that took them to different destinations, that when they arrived at those destinations in South America or in North America, that when they showed up in schools and began to advocate for Black people, that they were met with the same kinds of anti-Black experiences that make it challenging for them to do their work, regardless of if they're in Boston or Bogota, Brooklyn or Sao Paulo, right? For example. So that's some new work.
Wow. That's going to be great. I can't wait for it.
I got to make the time for it. Me too. Yeah, yeah.
You want me to ask the question?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I thought you were gonna handle it. All right. So this will be our quasi last question. We will have another question for you. Um, but as you mentioned earlier, and it has as folks have seen on social media in EdCal, you are going to be one of our keynotes for our 2026 Equity Institute in Anaheim. And the title of your keynote, as I opened the show with, Leading and Teaching Like Our Democracy Depends on It. So the question to you is, what does that actually mean? What does the phrase mean to you? And then also, why are you titling your keynote that?
Yeah. So I want to first give a nod that the motto at UC Berkeley, right, is educate like democracy depends on it, right? So I just want to just give a nod to that. Um, I think it's fair to say that um, we see that democracy is an idea, that America is a project, right? That it's something that has to be tested and that is being tested, right? Right now. I mean, if we look at who gets to participate in this government, democracies are places where people are represented in the government. Look at the president's cabinet. I don't think any of us are on the president's cabinet. So I think that there is this urgency of now for folks who are leading and who are teaching to be really to be alerted to the fact that democracy isn't a given, and that we need to be leading and teaching in ways that place a renewed responsibility on adults to organize their classrooms and organize schools with the recognition that democracy isn't a given in these great United States, that in some ways is celebrating its 250th anniversary, but in other ways, it's actually celebrating its 61-year anniversary because of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, right? So yes, we're celebrating 250 years, but it's only been 61 years that people who look like me could actually participate in this democracy. So I think that there is an urgency for folks to really take into account that this is a project. It's still an idea. And the way that ideas come into being is that people have to bring them into being. And the way that they can disappear is because look at what we're seeing now in this country, right?
Yeah, I was reading another article, right, about how it's just so easy to tear things down, and it's going to take forever it's going to take longer to build it back up. Um, in our past shows, we've been talking to folks about what's bringing them hope, like what's sustaining them, and a lot of the conversations have been, being in community, right? Being in spaces where they feel seen, where we can have these types of conversations and just be really upfront, but then not stopping with the work, right? Not laying down and taking it, if you will. And I think that there's just so much fear out there, right? Fear of lawsuits, fear of
Huh.
lots of things, um, all the threats on education on so many levels that I think some of our leaders in schools are just placating or trying to walk this line of keeping it quote unquote safe.
Yes.
But then I just wonder what that does, right, to the babies in the classroom. What does that do? What does that model for kids about what kind of difference they can make, right? Or what the future is going to be like for them. So I'm looking forward to the conversation you'll have with us. I know you're going to, give us a huge call to action and ask folks to look in the mirror.
Mm.
um, because it's so necessary. It's
Yeah.
absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We still have a voice in ways, and that voice doesn't always have to be for some of us, right? Like in this keynote that I gave, right? Folks said, you said the quiet part out loud. You talked about the body snatcher as being the same, that the apparatus that snatched bodies, right, in the 1800s are the same apparatus that's snatching bodies now. In some ways, I can say that. Um, and it's also realizing that there are that you that there is a memory of folks saying things like swing low, sweet chariot, saying the piece without saying the piece. And so we all have the capacity and power. Some can say it out loud, but some can sing a Negro spiritual to tell folks, right? That this is the path towards freedom without saying the thing.
Mm. Say it, sing it.
Write it, do it.
Mhm.
Yes.
Oh, well, you preach the word, Dr. Travis Bristol. And and we appreciate you for that. And we will end on that note. But before we go, as a reminder, we will be in Anaheim March 25th through the 27th for our 2026 Equity Institute featuring the amazing Dr. Travis Bristol. We'll also have Parveen Ahmadi, former ACSA president, former superintendent, consultant, and we'll have also the amazing Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz with us, closing us out. Very excited. Very excited to be back in space with you, Tracie. Like you said, we're right next door, but this is totally different. This is our classroom. Really happy. Again, Dr. Bristol, thank you so much
Thank you.
uh,
Thank you.
for bringing in the new year, uh, a new way of doing the show, and helping us to bring the critically conscious classroom back to our family and our viewers. So thank you so much. Before we close this out, Tracie, anything else that you want to leave our people with?
Just similarly, just thank you, Dr. Bristol, for spending the time with us, for breaking it down, giving us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I know that our listeners are going to be really interested in your research and the new research that's forthcoming. And I love what you said, Anthony, right? It actually just finished up Lunar New Year.
Yeah.
It is the new year. It really is the new year. And I think it's also an opportunity, right, to make some changes. This is the year of the fire horse, if
Mm.
folks didn't know that. So with the fire horse energy, it allows for lots of changes to be made. There's a lot of this urgency in the air, opportunities, the conditions at the same time. It also can maybe work to burn us out. So we have to be very intentional, right?
Mm.
We have to be very intentional at times to be able to slow down and breathe, take our rest when we need it, because we need that to do the work, the bold and courageous work we are doing. So
Yeah.
thank you
Yes.
both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep that fire horse energy burning, but make sure you manage it and maintain it properly. We will catch you all on the flip side as always. Love, peace.
Peace.